Hello and welcome to the ALCTS webinar, RDA for the non-cataloger, What's in it for you? I'm Carrie Cassio, Chair of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. Our presenter today is Lori Robare, Head of the Monographic Cataloging Team at the University of Oregon Libraries. She recently served as the Chair of the ALA-ALCTS Committee on Cataloging, Description, and Access, and has previously served as Chair of the ALA-ALCTS Subject Analysis Committee. Lori will provide an overview of changes in RDA records, particularly those affecting staff and technical services and those that will be noticeable in the OPAC. If you have questions for Lori, please type them into the question box on your screen. Lori will wait until the end of her presentation to answer questions, but you can type them in at any time. If we should go over time, Lori will answer any questions offline, and all participants will receive the answers by email. Also, please note that today's session will be recorded, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording and slides in a few days. You'll also receive an offer for access to a 30-day trial of the RDA toolkit with this presentation. We don't currently have a chat function in the GoToWebinar software so that you can talk to other attendees. But if you like, please use the Twitter hashtag ALCTSCE to talk further about today's session online. We won't be monitoring the Twitter feed during the presentation. Okay, there may be a slight delay, and I'm going to turn the presentation over to Lori.
Hello, and welcome to RDA for the non-cataloger. You've no doubt heard that there are changes afoot in cataloging. Today we're going to look at RDA, that's Resource Description and Access, from the perspective of those outside of cataloging, who may be wondering how this change will affect them. This should also be a good foundation for catalogers who have not yet delved into RDA. RDA has been developed as a replacement for AACR2, Anglo-American Cataloging Rules. It was developed by the Joint Steering Committee, or JSC, which also maintained AACR2. This is an international effort involving the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and now Germany. Each of these countries has a representative from its national library, for us that's the Library of Congress, and from the National Library Association, and it's, in particular, it's much of the feedback coming from its cataloging committee. So for us, that is ALA's Committee on Cataloging, Description, and Access, or CCDA, and John Addig is our representative from ALA. RDA was published in June 2010 after years in development, and it was then tested by US libraries for 9 months. After the test, LC and the other US national libraries decided to implement RDA, but to delay full implementation until early 2013. LC has been training its staff, and that's over 400 catalogers, over the past months. And as their staff are trained, they do use RDA for cataloging. So in addition, some testing libraries continued to catalog using RDA. So we are seeing an increasing quantity of RDA records in WorldCat. Still, every library can decide when or if they will implement RDA. The reality is that many libraries in the US rely heavily on LC for catalog records, so it is likely that we will see a definite shift toward RDA implementation this spring. But it will be a gradual transition for most libraries. There are probably RDA records in your catalogs now. They are compatible with existing records, and most libraries do not plan to recatalog older records. At my library, we have just over 1,000 RDA records in our catalog at this point. I also want to emphasize that RDA is still a work in progress. Revisions are still being made. In fact, in November, the JSC will meet and consider 52 revision proposals. And practices are changing as we get more experience using RDA. Also, the MARC format is changing. So you're going to see records reflecting different practices in this presentation and in your catalog. So why are we replacing AACR2? Well, AACR2 was published in 1978. Think about how different your life was in 1978. Some of you might not have even been born then. Technology, and the internet in particular, have really transformed the way we share information. There have been changes in publication formats, many new metadata standards, and really the place of the catalog in the information environment has changed. AACR2 is organized by classes of material. It has separate chapters for books, for music, for maps. It has evolved over the years to accommodate new types of resources. In fact, changes were being made so frequently that it moved to a loose leaf format that could be updated more easily. But it was designed for a different environment. AACR2 was designed for a card catalog environment. We create records that are basically text. They're intended to be read by a human. The MARC format made it possible for libraries to share catalog data among ourselves and to display it online. But records are still very structured text intended for people to read. These records look a lot like a card from a card catalog, just online and with some nice extra features. This is not a web-friendly format, AACR2 or MARC. We are very specialized, and this is difficult in a time when information on the web is much more interconnected. So RDA was actually initially thought of as AACR3, just another revision. But the name change signifies a fundamental change in approach, a rethinking of cataloging theory and practice. Yet, given all of our legacy records, it had to be compatible with existing records. It is based on internationally established principles, models, and standards, designed with the user in mind, using terminology that makes sense. And it is a more consistent and flexible framework for describing all types of resources, even those we don't yet know about. RDA defines individual data elements, many of which have controlled vocabulary lists. You think about our current environment, a lot of our bibliographic data is difficult for computers other than an ILS to interpret and manipulate. We have a mix of types of data in some fields, and we have a lot of very useful information buried in no fields. So RDA should help overcome this and provide data in a form that can be more easily used by computers to provide new and powerful services. RDA can and will be used with MARC, but it's also structured to work with new data formats. It clearly indicates the nature of relationships, for example, between works and their creators, and we'll see more about this. And it will support the integration of library catalog data into the broader environment. It's going to provide kind of a bridge from our current environment to new data structures, but do keep in mind that some of the benefits are not going to be realized in our current systems. So here are some things that are changing with RDA. There are changes in what you'll see in catalog records. These are mostly straightforward, and I think they're welcome. There are conceptual changes in how we think about cataloging and do cataloging. And there will be changes in how we talk about cataloging with you, too. And some structural changes that will affect the role of library data in the web environment. I'll touch on this only briefly today, but I think it's very exciting. I need to first say a few words about FRBR, Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records. This is the most important model underlying RDA. FRBR is a conceptual model. It's not a standard, it's not a system. It's a generalized way to look at our bibliographic universe of the things that libraries collect and the things our users want to do. Our users want to find something in a database or a collection, identify or confirm that what they found is what they were looking for, select the format that meets their needs, and obtain it or access it. These are called the FRBR user tasks. FRBR also provides a structure to support those user tasks. It includes an entity relationship model that defines entities, their characteristics or attributes, and the relationships among them. We'll take a quick look at the Group 1 entities. These are the products of intellectual or artistic endeavor. You could think of these as the things we collect. FRBR uses 4 levels of representation for these, and we're going to look at each of these briefly in the next slides with some examples and using some images. And I'd like to thank William Denton and Jody Schneider, who provided these images in a talk some years ago. First, we'll look at work. A work is the distinct intellectual creation or artistic creation. You can think of it as the story being told. It is very abstract. Alexandre Dumas was the creator of the work, The Three Musketeers. So when someone says, "Have you read The Three Musketeers?" they probably mean the work. Do you know the story? Not have you read a particular edition, or even have you read it in French or in English. So that content is characterized by how it is expressed. And an expression is the realization of a work in some form, text, sound, or image. It might be a text in French, or a translation into English, or a spoken expression, someone reading it aloud. This is still abstract. But when we talk about a particular translation of a book or a particular performance of a play, we're talking about an expression of a work. That is still abstract. It has to be packaged in order to be used. And a manifestation is that content contained in some sort of a package. It could be a publication of one English translation by a particular publisher in a particular year. This is what our current catalogs represent, mostly, though they do have elements of work and expression sometimes. They tend to represent a particular manifestation. There can be many different manifestations of a particular expression. The same translation could be published by different publishers at different times. Now in this slide, it has some examples of DVDs, videos. I just want to mention that a film would actually be a separate work that could have different expressions and maybe multiple manifestations. And also the comic book up here, that would be a separate work. An item could be the physical object that sits on a shelf and gets checked out, or the electronic equivalent. You know, it's what we collect and house and circulate. You could think of items as copies. We might have 2 copies of a particular manifestation and 1 copy of another. So that is FRBR Group 1 in a nutshell. It does get more complicated because many works get reprinted, revised, adapted. Screenplays are written from books, movies are made. So when does a work become a new work? And when are we dealing with an expression of the same work? This question can become complicated. Now, catalogers have long made distinctions regarding modifications of works, but we've not done this type of conceptual modeling in FRBR terminology before. Barbara Tillett from LC is an expert on FRBR, and she's shared this graphic of the family of works and the cutoff point for when various types of adaptations cross the line to becoming new works. So FRBR's Group 2 entities are those responsible for the intellectual or artistic content, or physical production and dissemination, or custodianship. So these are person and corporate body, and then we add family, which actually comes from a different model, FRAD, Functional Requirements for Authority Data. This was added in particular for the needs of the archival community. So there are relationships between the Group 2 entities and the Group 1 entities, and this slide is also from Barbara Tillett. A work like The Three Musketeers is created by a person, Alexandre Dumas. An expression, like a translation, is realized by a person, the translator. A manifestation is produced by a corporate body, the publisher, and an item could be owned by a corporate body, perhaps a library. So why am I showing you this? Well, figuring out and expressing these relationships will be a big part of cataloging with RDA, and this is what's new to catalogers. There will be a learning curve. Those of you who've ever used ACR2, even if only in a cataloging class long ago, may remember those separate chapters for different formats, for books, for music, for motion pictures. RDA is organized very differently, and you need some familiarity with the FRBR model just to understand the outline. This is just the beginning of the outline, the instructions for recording attributes of different entities. The blue text at the end shows placeholders for subject entities, concept, object, and event. Those are the Group 3 entities, which I'm not discussing today. And the plan is to include instructions for these chapters in the future. Now let's move on to changes in what you'll see in catalog records. First, with a few words about changes in terminology. Author in RDA becomes creator. Heading, something that came straight out of the card catalog era for the text typed at the heading of a catalog card, becomes authorized access point. Uniform title becomes preferred title. And main entry, well, it is complicated. The concept is still there in RDA, but it is expressed in a different way. We name the work with the preferred title plus the authorized access point for the creator if appropriate. So here's one of the biggest overall changes in what you'll see in catalog records. In ACR2, we transcribe information exactly as it appears, usually from the title page when we're talking about books, for some parts of the catalog record, for the title, the statement of responsibility, publication information. Yet it is not really exactly as it appears. We adjust it a lot. We abbreviate some things, we omit some things, and we add Latin terms and abbreviations. In RDA, the overarching principle is take what you see. So there will be much less adjusting, abbreviating, omitting, and bracketing. And this will mean that it is easier for machine capture of data as well. And from anecdotal evidence, it is also a lot easier for new catalogers to learn. Now, one example is that we're no longer using that Latin sic, S-I-C, to indicate errors, and here's an example. This is an example of an error in the title, meaning it appears this way in the book, and also an example of an addition statement. In ACR2, we would transcribe the title as it appears, but we would show that we know it's an error by that sic, and then we abbreviate the addition statement. In RDA, we give the title as it appears, including the error, and we don't flag it in any way. We can correct it in a note if it seems important. And for the addition statement, if it appears this way, spelled out in the book, then that is how we record it. Capitalization may differ in an RDA record. It may match what is on the item. In ACR2, we adjusted capitalization basically to follow sentence case. In RDA, the basic instruction is to do the same, to use sentence case, but there is an option to give the capitalization as it appears on the item, and that also can make it easier for using data from other sources. You will not see the Latin at all, and that is because we have no limit on the number of people we record in a single statement of responsibility. So in this example, for this title, there were 4 authors, and we have a rule of 3 in ACR2, and so if there are more than 3, we record the first, and then use et al. To show that we are, there are other people we've omitted. With RDA, there is no limit, so you can give all of the authors in the statement of responsibility. Or there is an alternative to give the first and summarize the omission, which could be quite helpful if you happen to have, for example, 20 authors. The rule of 3 also affects access points. In ACR2, if there are 1, 2, or 3 authors, you give author entries for all. But if there are more than 3, you give only the first. If the 4th or 5th author was someone important to your community, you might want to give an author entry, but you should not according to the rules. In fact, in this situation, under ACR2, authors beyond the first are not normally mentioned in the record at all, so cannot be found even using keyword. With RDA, you give as many as you deem necessary, but only the first is required. Another difference is that the first named author, Raymond Wolfinger here, would be given main entry, and with ACR2, this would have title main entry. Here are a few highlights of changes to access points for personal names. Many of them are the result of spelling out abbreviations or using English instead of Latin. So we have century spelled out, the abbreviation for October spelled out. Instead of the Latin circa, we use approximately, and FL was the the English abbreviation for flourished, and instead of that we are using, in U.S. cataloging practice, we are using active. In addition, terms indicating relationships such as junior or senior are considered an integral part of the name in RDA, and they will be included in the access point. With ACR2, such terms were included only if we needed them to distinguish one name from another. So even though we know Hank Williams Jr. by that name, including the junior, junior was not part of his heading under ACR2 because we had just his date alone, date of birth, created a unique heading. So with RDA, it would be included as part of the access point. Here are some of the most noticeable changes in access points for corporate names and titles. A big one is that department will be spelled out if it is used that way by the body itself. So the Ohio Department of Commerce represents itself with department spelled out on its publications. This is what the authorized access point will be. There's a big change for parts of the Bible. For one thing, we will spell out Old Testament and New Testament when the access point is just for that testament. But when we have an access point for an individual book of the Bible, such as Genesis, we will no longer include the intervening Old Testament or New Testament. It'll just be Bible Genesis. And the spelling for the Quran will be changed. There are many more changes in access points that I think are less noticeable and less significant. I'm really just hitting the highlights here. Now let's talk about the publication information. Here too we see some Latin terms replaced. In ACR2, when we could not even guess the place of publication or the name of the publisher, we used some Latin abbreviations, SL for sine local and SN for sine nomine. Without place, without name. These were intended, I think, to transcend language. I'm not sure that they're really very understandable to our patrons. With RDA, those are replaced with English explanations. Place of publication not identified, publisher not identified. But actually, for place of publication, we will most often give a probable place, even if it is just United States with a question mark. Dates can be important to staff in many areas of the library when you're identifying a book to order or request via interlibrary loan, or when you're helping a patron identify a particular version or edition. I want to talk about some changes related to copyright dates, because this is one that I think will be quite noticeable. With ACR2, if the date of publication was unknown and we had a copyright date, we would give the copyright date in its place as an inferred date of publication. But the copyright date was not usually in the record otherwise. Under RDA, copyright date is a separate element, and it is often included in records, even if it's the same as the publication date. During the U.S. RDA test, there was a policy decision to always include the copyright date if present, and many libraries have continued to do that. So here's an example of a book published by Harvest House Publishers with no place or date of publication given, but there is a copyright date. And here's what we would do under ACR2. Under RDA, if you knew that Harvest House was in the United States, you could supply that in brackets, and we could assume a probable date of publication of 2010 based on the copyright date, but under the guidelines for the test, we would have included the copyright date as well. But there are a lot of options in RDA, so it actually would have been also correct just to give the assumed publication date of 2010, or to say date of publication not identified, copyright 2010. And it is a choice to use copyright spelled out or the copyright symbol. I've mentioned that there have already been some new developments that affect how RDA records might display. This slide shows how publication statements with a copyright date were done until quite recently. So you will see some publication statements like this, but there's been a recent change in the MARC format. I don't plan to talk about MARC coding very much in this presentation, but in this case I do want to point out the codes behind the change. Previously, we used field 260 for publication information, and we included a lot of information there, not just publication, distribution, printing, copyright, as we've seen. The new 264 field helps untangle the different kinds of information we've traditionally combined in publication statements. RDA has separate elements for all of these, for production, distribution, manufacture, copyright, in addition to publication. So now MARC allows us to make different statements about different functions, and it does this with a repeatable 264 field where the second indicator tells you what kind of statement it is. Second indicator of 1 is a publication statement. Second indicator of 4 is the copyright notice. Catalog displays can be adjusted so that the copyright dates are displayed and labeled separately, as shown here in a record from Stanford's catalog. Similarly, the catalog could show separate statements about distribution or printing. Here's another example of less abbreviating and more words as we move through the catalog record. Under ACR2, this is the extent statement, sometimes labeled as description. We used a lot of brackets and abbreviating in this field. And so with RDA, the brackets go away and things are spelled out. If there are 21 unnumbered pages, we will say so in words. I do want to mention, you'll see that we retain the cm for centimeters. Cm is considered a symbol and not an abbreviation, so that still will be as it appears here. In addition, we're still using some abbreviations for durations and measurements. Now here's a very important change that will have a big impact on what our patrons see. We are no longer using the General Material Designation, or the GMD. The GMD is the bracketed information in the title that conveys the type of material, such as electronic resource, sound recording, video recording, and there are many others. There are many problems with the GMD. They include resources that are more than one type of thing represented by a GMD. For example, streaming video is both a video recording and an electronic resource. But what would you use? You can only pick one, and so for that we use electronic resource. The GMD is being replaced by 3 new elements. Content type, which reflects the content of the resource. Is it text? Is it performed music? Is it spoken word? The media type, or what kind of device do you need to use this resource? And the carrier type, what kind of package is it in? Is it an audio disc, an online resource, a video disc, a volume? New MARC fields have been defined for these elements, and they are the 336 for content type, 337 for media type, and 338 for carrier type. I'll show some examples of what goes into these fields. We do use controlled vocabularies for the terms that go into these fields. And these collectively replace the GMD. So there are a lot of questions about catalog display here. What will our systems do with these? They are not necessarily meant to display as the exact terms, as you'll see in just a moment. So could our systems generate icons or text that would be a good early alert for patrons about the format of the material? Here's an example of a GMD in an ACR2 record. This is for the ebook, but electronic resource could also be for streaming video or for streaming audio. We can't really tell. Here's what would happen in an RDA record for that ebook. And again, I'm showing the MARC coding here, but in just a moment we'll see some OPAC displays. The text in red is what goes away, and it is replaced here for an ebook by content type text, media type computer, and carrier type online resource. Here's some examples of what would be used for a DVD and for a streaming video. where we actually can say that a streaming video, is an online resource and a two-dimensional moving image. But I think you see here too why we might not necessarily want to display all of these terms as they are in our OPACs. Here's some examples for a music CD and for a score. So let's look at some catalog displays. If you display them in a catalog record and you did nothing other than no other adjustments, they might display with your description or extent statement. This is what happened in our III catalog at my library before we made any adjustments. This is for a DVD where these just came across. We decided to suppress the display of these fields, but we could have chosen instead to provide specific labels for them or just display just some of the terms. BYU chose to display them, and they used the labels content type, medium, and format. And this example shows what is used for a print book: text, unmediated, and volume. RDA applies these elements to all materials, not just to non-print, which was the case with our application of ACR2. I do want to acknowledge that this is a difficult change for some libraries. I've heard in particular from colleagues in public libraries that patrons and staff rely on the GMD to alert them to the format of the material. So large print in particular is a concern for public libraries. There is a new MARC subfield that has recently been defined for large print, but it's the 340 subfield and font size. The challenge is that it's not in a place that's very easily, that is used by our current ILSs to generate any kind of a warning. So some libraries will continue to add the GMD locally, meaning in their local systems, not to master records in the WorldCat database. And others are finding ways to map some of the terms from the new fields to the title field, if that's where they really want it, or to the search results page, as we'll see in a moment. Also, some of you may be familiar with MARC Edit, which was developed by Terry Reese. Terry is exploring options for generating GMDs as well as dealing with some other RDA-related changes. And he has just released the RDA Helper, which is an in-development tool that can do things like generate GMDs for batches of records. And he's really interested in feedback as he continues to develop that tool. Here's another example from BYU's catalog, which displays the carrier type in a list of search results. And I really like this because video disc is pretty obvious here. To my eye, perhaps even more noticeable than video recording in the second result. If your library uses a discovery layer, you'll want to take a look at what happens there with RDA records. And ask your catalogers if you need help finding RDA records to look at. My library uses WorldCat Local, and the GMD has not been a part of that display at all, even before RDA. There are other codes in the record that are used to identify the format, shown here, DVD video. So GMD, that's one reason the GMD isn't as big of an issue for my library. So how can you tell if you're looking at an RDA record? Well, much will depend on the display options in your ILS or your discovery layer. You may or may not see those new fields that replace the GMD. Perhaps the easiest way is to look for words spelled out where you would normally see abbreviations. And the extent statement, which is often labeled description or physical description, is a good place to check. So this is an RDA record. The presence of the copyright symbol here is another indication that it is likely an RDA record. I'd like to share a couple of thoughts about the impact of RDA on library operations. The folks in acquisitions and copy cataloging and ILL need to know enough about these changes to be able to identify RDA records and understand what to do with them. I've shown a little bit of the MARC coding here. The 040 subfield E RDA is what really identifies it. Most often, the fixed field description will have an I for ISBD punctuation because that's what we're still using in the U.S. It's important that staff be able to identify a matching record and understand what looks different. Copy catalogers need to know what to do, so local policies are important. What should be edited, if anything? I would urge you to retain data in records even if it cannot be used by your ILS today. I know there can be a temptation to delete fields that look strange, but please do retain them. It's also important to make sure that your ILS can load the new MARC fields and that you make decisions about display and indexing. RDA does not dictate these decisions. So think about that GMD. If it is important to your users, can you make changes that will provide that information somehow? You really do want to take a look at the new MARC fields and make sure they can even come into your system. The 264 is a good example. If we hadn't made a change to our load table in my library, we would have not gotten any publication information at all for resources, so we needed to add that field. Also, talk to your vendor and ask them what is being done to support use of the RDA fields. They need to hear from us about providing functionality that will support these new elements. I'd like to turn now to another important aspect of RDA, identifying people and corporate bodies and families and naming relationships. For now, I'll focus on people, just to keep it simple. Catalogers try very hard to distinguish people with similar names so that we can create a unique access point in our catalogs. With ACR2, we used authority records to document the choice of that heading and to provide justification to support that choice. With RDA, there's a real shift in how we use authority records. We do use them to identify a person with structured information. The access point is there too, but the focus is on the data that identifies the person. This is the public view of an RDA authority record in LC's authorities database. You may notice that it identifies this person's birth date and her place of birth, as well as her profession or occupation. This is the MARC view of that same record, so you see where that information is coming from. RDA defines new elements that help identify a person, and these new MARC fields have been created for them. In addition to the ones I just talked about, you'll see that it is possible to identify the gender of a person. There is great potential to make use of these fields in searching. They can now be searched in Connection, which is the cataloging interface to WorldCat. I searched female and composer and retrieved 78 authority records. Now, this is by no means a comprehensive list of female composers, but it's not a bad result given that we have just begun supplying these fields. Now let's talk about relationships. I'd like to credit Diane Hillman for the foundation of the following slides, which I have adapted and expanded upon. This is a very important feature with great potential for the future. RDA allows us to name relationships between a person and a resource. For example, Jane Doe is the choreographer of this dance. Between resources, one is a parody of another. And between people, for example, Samuel Clemens is the real identity of Mark Twain. And to name these relationships in a very structured way that computers can understand. So in a catalog record, author access points may be followed by terms describing the role of the person or the organization, such as author, editor, composer, production company, sponsoring body. I say may because this is optional in RDA. Not all records will include it. If you do see it in a record, this is how it would appear. This is a record for an RDA record for a music CD. where we can see that Robert Schumann is the composer and that we have a person and an ensemble identified as performers. So with these, it is also important to understand the impact on your ILS. Do you need to make any changes in indexing or display? In my ILS, we have it set up to display them but not to index them, and so we don't have any split files. But people can see them in the records, which I think is helpful. Also, in a catalog record, access points for related works may have introductory terms specifying the nature of the relationship, such as based on, abridgment of, parody of, revision of. Again, this is optional, but it's very useful. Here's an example of a record that explicitly states that it is a translation of another work in a form that could be understood by a machine. And here's just a little more MARC. I wanted to show this slide from Adam Schiff's excellent presentation, Changes from ACR2 to RDA, a comparison of examples, to show you what's going on behind the scenes. He shows here that in an ACR2 record, here for Rhett Butler's People, we can only make a textual note, that's the 500 field here shown in red, about the relationship of this work to another, that it is a sequel to Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. And then we also provide an access point for Gone with the Wind. In an RDA record, we can say explicitly in a coded field, the 700, also here in red, that Rhett Butler's People is a sequel to Gone with the Wind. And so a computer could actually pull together all of the sequels to Gone with the Wind. Or think about the potential for bringing together all of the parodies of Pride and Prejudice. This greatly enhances our ability to provide structured information about a lot of things, about people, corporate bodies, and families generally, but especially those that are important to our local institutions and communities where we're really the experts, about the roles that they perform in relation to the resources in our collections, and about those relationships among resources. We've always tried to do this in cataloging, but we were limited in how we could express it in textual note fields. So with this information in a structured form that can be manipulated by machines, the possibilities for search and discovery are very exciting. I want to say just a few words about the potential for RDA. And again here, I'd like to thank Diane Hillman for explaining all of this to me. And I have used some of Diane's slides as a foundation for what follows, but I've updated them with my own examples. So any errors are mine. This part is more technical, but it's very exciting, and I'm just going to describe it briefly in very general terms to give you an idea of what might be ahead. RDA data elements and those controlled vocabularies, such as the content type, media type, carrier type, have been registered, and that means they've been formally defined in an open metadata registry, and each term has a unique URI. So machines can use and interpret catalog information in a new way. This opens up our world to others who want to organize and structure information or who want to use our data. This is the metadata registry. It is freely available on the web, and all of the elements and vocabularies in RDA are registered here. Here's the listing of relationships for persons, corporate bodies, and families. And we see that real identity is one. When we look at the entry for real identity, we see that it has a description and a stable URI, stable and open URI. Anyone who wants to use this to express that relationship between people may do so. And this matters because this work is the basis for moving library data out of its current silo and expressing our accumulated knowledge about bibliographic data to the rest of the world. Others will use these vocabularies even if they never look at the textual guidance in RDA. So when entities are defined on the open web like this with a stable and open URI, a semantic web application using a resource description or RDF, resource description framework or RDF statement could understand that Mark Twain is the real identity. I'm sorry, that Samuel Clemens is the real identity of Mark Twain. While real identity might be very well known in this particular case, think of all the cases where that relationship might not be so well known. Now we're easing into a little preview of linked data here. That is a method of exposing and connecting data on the web from different sources. And it's a big topic, much too big to really discuss today. And I'm just learning about it myself, but I do want to show you how data in RDA records is already helping us get there. Here's a portion of Mark Twain's authority record showing explicitly coded data about him, similar to what we saw earlier. You might notice, the sharp-eyed among you might notice that the profession or occupation terms here, writer and lecturer, are not capitalized. This is another example of how practice has already changed. Today we would capitalize those, but in earlier practice we weren't necessarily doing that. So this authority record with that structured data is linked to the Virtual International Authority File, or VIAF. This links authority files from many countries showing the different forms of name. And that is referenced in the Wikipedia entry for Mark Twain. Down at the bottom of the entry, we see the link to VIAF. This embeds some authority control into biographical articles on Wikipedia. It's information which can be used to help build tools linking back into Wikipedia or for maintaining its content. So this feels to me like the beginning of using library information to help provide some level of authority control outside of our world on the broader web. And I think it's very exciting. But to pull us back now to more familiar ground, today we are still working in MARC. We've seen that MARC is changing. There are a lot of new fields. There are more discrete data elements. In text that has been impossible to process and manipulate, is now easier to process and manipulate. But is it changing enough? Well, no. MARC has served us very well, but it is based on 40-year-old techniques for data management, and it is library specific at a time when that isolates us. It is time to move beyond MARC. LC is leading the Bibliographic Framework Transition Initiative to identify and develop a new framework. This is intended to be a collaborative process with the focus of translating the MARC 21 format to a linked data model, while retaining as much as possible the robust and beneficial aspects of MARC. So LC has contracted with Zephyra to provide a model or models as the starting point for discussion in the community, and also to provide an analysis of related initiatives that are underway. I'd just like to share a few closing thoughts. Be nice to your catalogers. They have a lot to deal with right now. Chocolate always helps. I know there are a few catalogers in the audience, and just want to leave you with some closing thoughts as well. Be patient with yourself and with others as we're all learning, and take advantage of some free training resources. There is a lot of help from LC and others freely available in the Catalogers Learning Workshop. I will have a closing slide with these URLs, and you'll get a copy of these slides as well. It's wonderful to be able to use the materials that LC used to train its own catalogers. It's really fantastic, and it will make the transition easier for all of us. There is a lot of help from ALCTS, webinars such as this one, and you may not know that the webinars are free after 6 months. They are archived, so you can go back and see things even that you didn't see the first time around. For those who want to start learning about RDA in depth, I highly recommend 2 webinars. FRBR as a Foundation for RDA by Robert Maxwell, and Changes from ACR2 to RDA, a comparison of examples by Adam Schiff. And there are many more in the archive, many on more specialized topics. The next webinar in this fall ALCTS series is Thomas Brendorfer's RDA and 10 Easy Steps on November 7th, and that will be great for those who want to learn to catalog using RDA. Finally, no matter what your job, you may have experienced that moment when you need to explain something complex briefly. Say if you're in the elevator with your boss who turns to you and says, "What is this RDA thing I keep hearing about?" This is how I would distill it. RDA aims to provide catalog data that will help libraries define our presence on the web, with well-defined and structured data elements, clearly indicating relationships among works and the people responsible for them, with clearer language for our patrons and much easier for computers to manipulate. Remember that it is a work in progress. It is not perfect, but I do believe it is an essential step in moving us into the environment that our patrons are in. And I would like to thank several people who provided content that really helped me with this presentation: William Denton, Jody Schneider, Diane Hillman, Adam Schiff, Barbara Tillett, and leave you with some resources that I have referred to. And thank you very much for your attention. And I would think we're ready for questions.
Thanks, Lori. There are some questions that have come in. One came in the beginning when you were kind of doing your introduction. What are the new data formats that RDA will be used with as opposed to MARC? Is that something you can really speak to yet?
That's a great question. Some of them are not yet known to us. For example, we don't yet know what will come out of the Bibliographic Framework Transition Initiative. But I can mention at least one real-life example where RDA is being used in a really different environment. If you've heard of the Extensible Catalog, XC for short, XC uses RDA elements as part of its metadata schema in combination with elements from other content standards. So they're not using RDA for everything, but they have chosen RDA elements to help with certain things that RDA does really well and other content standards don't necessarily do well. I don't have a lot of specifics, but there are some great presentations on XC that show how RDA is being used in that environment. So that's one example that I would look to for sort of an understanding. It helped me a lot understand how RDA might translate into other environments.
Okay, thanks. When you were talking about having the new RDA authority files in with your regular ones, can you explain what you meant by split files related to access points?
Thank you. That's one. As soon as that came out of my mouth, I realized that was sort of cataloger jargon. A split file happens when we have works by we have, say, 20 resources by one author, but some of them are listed under one access point for the author and some of them are listed under something different. And if you used something like composer under some of the entries for Robert Schumann, and that was indexed, when you searched on Schumann, Robert, whatever, the ones that had composer after it could be listed separately from the ones that don't have it at all, which would be most of the things in your catalog. So that would split all of the resources by Schumann, and that's what we call a split file. And we try to avoid that. We want to have everything by one author retrieved under one access point.
Okay, there's another question, I think, in the same vein with how will new RDA entries map to those old AACR2 records with your Hank Williams Jr. example. can you find the old and new records in a mixed catalog, or is it just that you're going to have those separate searches that you'll have to do?
That's another great question. I'll mention, I don't think that everything is entirely clear about this yet, about how we will work it all out. Well, one thing that is happening is that the authority file that we use in U.S. libraries, which is most of us access through WorldCat, through Connection, the cataloging interface. It is maintained at LC, but many libraries contribute to that authority file through the Program for Cooperative Cataloging. So we'll call that the NACO authority file, Name Authority Cooperative. That is where we have the decision about what is the authoritative access point for a person or corporate body or a family. And there is a very big project being undertaken to change and update many of those access points to their RDA forms. The ones that can be changed by machine very easily, such as spelling out abbreviations, like the abbreviation for October to the full one, October. Those changes are going to be made in an automated fashion close to March 31st, 2013, which is the day one for when all of the NACO libraries and LC will be doing RDA authority work only. So there will be some machine updating of those authority files that are in sort of a central database that we all rely on. And there will be ways to make changes in bibliographic records based on those updated authority records, but we don't quite know how that will all play out. For libraries that use an authorities vendor for updating headings in their bibliographic records, I expect that your vendors will be right on top of that, making those changes. For others, there will be some work involved in making the changes in your local catalog. And I don't want to underestimate the work that's involved, but there's a lot that can be done by machine. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. We've got some really smart people working on this within the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, and I'm encouraged to see how much thought they've put into it. So we'll be seeing a lot of changes in the national kind of authority file close to the end of March 2013.
Great, that's really helpful. This is an interesting question. Will fixed fields in the MARC record become obsolete?
Well, no. I think as long as we are using MARC, I don't see that it will be doing away with fixed fields. In fact, as you've seen, we've been making a lot of changes to MARC, but there is a sense that we're done with most of those changes in MARC. There will probably be some additional tweaking. The committee that oversees MARC, which is called MARBI, I won't go into a lot of the details of how MARC is maintained, but there is a committee that oversees changes to it. And that group is actually going to be phased out, and a new group appointed that will focus on this new bibliographic framework and the environment that we're in that includes MARC and will continue to include MARC for some time. So, sorry, I'm getting into a long answer here, but I do expect that the fixed fields as we now know them in MARC records will remain in MARC records. It is possible that new values could be defined for some of those fixed fields, but I don't expect that they would be going away.
Great. Well, I think that we are at the end of our time and actually at the end of our questions.
Oh, terrific.
So if anyone does have follow-up questions, you can always contact Lori, and you will be getting the slides and a recording in your email. So thanks, Lori, for pointing out the differences in those RDA records, how we're transcribing things, and pointing out some of those choices we're going to have to make for index and display. I know that we're kind of talking about that right now in my library. I also want to thank all of our attendees. I hope that you found today's session useful. You'll soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to those questions and return the form to us. Your comments are always helpful to the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee as we plan new offerings. Information about all ALCTS Continuing Education offerings can be found on our homepage under Online Learning. We do have some coming up, the last in our RDA series, and then we're also doing storage and digital curation and holdings comparisons to fill out the rest of this year. Check out the 2013 web course schedule. Those are not open yet, and our next monthly e-forum will be on government information now and in the future. So if you've been following some of the GPO changes, they'll be talking about that. I'd like to thank also the ALCTS CAM section, the RDA Planning and Training Task Force, for stewarding these RDA webinars in this series. I'd also like to thank Amy Lana and Jane Rosario for providing technical support, as well as Julie Reese and Vicki Gruzinski in the ALCTS office. Our technical support experts always make it possible for us to present these webinars smoothly. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and we hope that you will participate in other ALCTS continuing education events in the future.